The abstract consisted of this picture, and the idea would be that this ship here is HMS Ontology. That is an old Mediterranean harbour somewhere, very scruffy, and the ship is this new gleaming white ship is sailing out into the oceans, where real work can be done rather than the sort of stuff that you do when you sit in your medieval library fussing about what Bonaventure might have meant by individuation. And someone pointed out after the talk that the ship is actually going backward. Brentano made this claim. The method of all philosophy is nothing other than that of the natural sciences. So I'm putting forward a somewhat similar thesis, namely that we shouldn't be doing philosophy anymore. The true method of what we wanted to achieve when doing philosophy was the method of the science of ontology. In 1874, he argued that it's psychology which is the core discipline of philosophy. And then in 1879, Wundt created the world's first laboratory of psychology. So when Brentano was writing, psychology was not really an empirical discipline. That was only just beginning. Brentano and Wundt were at the beginnings of modern psychology. You can see how students of Wundt, who were much more influential in the longer term, spread through the world, and including to America, and students of Brentano spread more through Central Europe, but influenced the subsequent history of psychology to some degree, and the subsequent history of philosophy to a much greater degree. First laboratory of psychology in America. Wundt gets formal recognition for his strange new empirical psychology work. Carl Stumpf, who was one of the most important early students of Brentano, publishes a book on the psychology of sound, and Wundt establishes a journal to start publishing in the realm of experimental psychology. 1889, you have the first Congress of Psychology. Meinong founds the first laboratory of psychology in Graz. There is psychology in Chinese, albeit it's called mental philosophy. And the title of Wundt's new journal was Philosophical Studies. American Psychological Association founded. Stumpf is given a chair of philosophy in Berlin, a very, very powerful chair. So it's a direct from the ministry kind of thing. And he's told that he has to establish in Berlin an institute of psychology. So this was a thing to do to show your power in this era. So we're 1894, still very early on. And then the Berlin Institute, which grew out of Brentano, influenced psychology through the Gestaltists. So Wertheimer, Köhler and Kafka are the three great figures of Gestalt psychology, which has now become, in a way, part of the mainstream of psychology, but it's no longer called Gestalt psychology. It's just called Principles Governing Perceptual Organization. And Twardowski, who was another Brentano student, founded the first psychological laboratory in Poland. All of these people were professors of philosophy. They didn't have professors of psychology in those days. So there is a question, when was psychology born? Roughly speaking, when Wundt's laboratory got official recognition, or when the first professor of psychology was created, or when the first department of psychology was created. All of those are at different times. But roughly speaking, in this time, the discipline of psychology was born. A new science was born. Now why? Well, people hated philosophy because in Germany particularly they had crises all the time. Hegelians hated young Hegelians hated Marxists, Marxists hated Fichteans, and so on. So each group was fighting other groups, and no one seemed to be making any progress. It was very much a matter of in-group competition. People wanted jobs, and so they joined movements, but it was the job which mattered. It was not the philosophical content that mattered. Husserl, in a very early stage in his career, worked with Weierstrass, who was a mathematician. And Weierstrass, I'm not sure if this is exactly right, but roughly right. Weierstrass married the daughter of Hegel. Weierstrass is a mathematician, a great thinker. He had a sign in his office which said, "Hegel shall not be reviled in this office." Not because he was a fan of Hegel, just because he'd married Hegel's daughter. Now, but that shows you that there was a climate in which people did not really want to have philosophers around anymore. You didn't go to study philosophy, it was seen as being a dead end. And so they were looking for new ways of tackling philosophical problems. And empirical results were regarded as being a benefit. So how can we make philosophy experimental? No one today would ever think along those lines. But then it was regarded as a new and exciting idea. And it meant that there would be an increasing intersection between philosophy and other disciplines. So philosophy of science started to be important. Not just philosophy of psychology or philosophy of the mind, but philosophy of science generally, trying to make philosophy itself more exciting by linking it to extra philosophical things. This is a long quote from Stumpf. German idealism, which is all this Hegel stuff, failed. And Stumpf is arguing that the reason it failed was because of this division of labor, division of groups, constant battle between groups based on dogma and intolerance. That was his idea. And this, he says, is alien to science which rests on the principle of cooperation. I think he's exactly right, and I think that was exactly the problem. All right, so what do you need to found a new discipline? You need a career path. You need to be able to get jobs in the discipline. You need journals, institutes, departments in universities, degrees, ideally, conferences. You need a society. You need a subject matter. And for the psychologist, this was the mind or mental processes. You need methods. You need results. And you need teaching. There needs to be something which means you need textbooks, you need training, you need content. And now, what does that do? Well, this creates a struggle for resources. There was a philosophers' trade union protest which led to an advertisement in the Frankfurt newspaper. Declaration of lecturers in philosophy in Germany against the occupation of philosophical professorships with representatives of experimental psychology. Now, another typical result will be that the new discipline will be full of young people with scraggly hair from outlying cities, because all the philosophers in the big established cities are going to be doing philosophy and being successful. So in Austria and places like that, in Bohemia, you will find people doing this new psychology. And they will then be dismissed by the people doing the big city philosophy as being trivial in one way or another, scientists or materialists. But on the other hand, because all of these young, scraggly people are doing new work, which is visible and international and so forth, they'll get more resources. They'll have bigger conferences. They'll have more urgency in their work. In the modern day terminology, they'll get more grants. So now we come to the distinction between good old-fashioned metaphysics, which is a part of philosophy, and ontology, which is a discipline which is designed to be the basis for applied ontology in the realm of data-driven science and other data-driven activities of various sorts. Then we have the technological artifacts created by ontologists, which are classification systems of various sorts. And we have the National Centre for Biomedical Ontology, which was created as a collaboration of these groups, a lot of funding, and you see that the Department of Philosophy in Buffalo was one of the collaborators. This was the original website. If you went to Google whenever I caught this image, you got 54 million hits for ontology, and number 4 was the gene ontology. Number 3 was ontology computer science in brackets. Number 1 was What is an Ontology by Tom Gruber, who is an artificial intelligence scientist responsible for the Siri app. So at least 4 out of the top 6 are related to ontology in the applied sense. And this is a broader illustration of how ontology boomed. So in 2004, if you went to Google, you get 58,000 hits on ontology in Heidegger, even though ontology is a big thing in Heidegger. That's because the Heideggerians didn't buy computers. But for ontology and information systems, you get 702,000. And 2006, that's when I took the slide from a minute ago, that's 51.4 for ontology as a whole, 2.7 for ontology and philosophy, 9.8 for ontology and database. And then here in Buffalo, we founded, in tandem with people from Stanford, the National Center for Ontological Research. And these are some of the organizations which came to Buffalo for the opening event. So that some of them are academic, some of them are research. We had NIST, we had the Lawrence National Laboratory, the gene ontology. They came to Buffalo because they realized that the discipline of ontology in general, not just biomedical ontology, but ontology in general, was important to the various different kinds of work that they were doing. NCORE, the National Center for Ontological Research, was an organization established to create the new discipline of ontology. So just as psychology was created in 1890 or thereabouts, out of the mothership called philosophy, so ontology was created in 2005 or thereabouts, out of the mothership called philosophy. And the goals were to advance ontology as a science, to advance education in ontology, and to develop all those measures of quality that I was referring to earlier. So we have ontology, the science. And one of the first initiatives which we established around this time was the OBO Foundry, which was designed to create in biology a collection of ontology modules which would be non-overlapping, developed in tandem on the basis of scientifically tested principles, and which would be open. So the Open Biomedical Ontologies Foundry. And this is the very early sketch of what the OBO Foundry would look like. Some of these ontologies have been approved for being in the OBO Foundry. Some of the gene ontology, or the 3 gene ontologies, most importantly. Some of them are waiting in the queue, as it were, because we have very high standards. And some of them have been renamed. So the Functional Genomics Investigation Ontology was renamed the Ontology for Biomedical Investigation. And so OBI, and it is part of the OBO Foundry. The protein ontology is part. I've referred to some of the new disciplines which have arisen. And so how did old ontology work as part of philosophy, otherwise known as metaphysics? Well, it worked by people engaging in pleasant conversations, sometimes in arguments, and promoting theses and defining terms, sometimes logically. So Roderick Chisholm is probably the best example of good methodology in the old ontology world, because he tried to define every single term, apart from a few primitives, which he declared as primitives. And they aim for logical cleverness, but they don't aim for utility. So this is an example. Sometimes they aim for reductionism, so we've talked about that before. Sometimes they aim just to do ontology insofar as it seems to be implied by the needs of first-order predicate logic. Sometimes they're nominalists. Sometimes they believe in concepts. And each one of these ontologies forms a kind of sect within the philosophical world. Now, science is never sectarian. And so the goal is to find a way of doing ontology which would be non-sectarian. So the new discipline of ontology exists. It has conferences, it has journals. So an example of the way we worked, and we wrote papers on this at the very beginning of BFO. What is a system? Well, we have systems in the body. What is the ontological assay of a system, in the sense that a digestive system and a respiratory system and so on are systems? And the ontological assay would strive to be applicable to other kinds of systems. For instance, the solar system, or the IBM system for contracting, or the New York subway system. And so the first thing that appears to be true of all of those systems is that they're made of material entities. The second thing is that they're made of multiple material entities, multiple objects. The third thing is that these multiple objects are causally interconnected. The next thing is that some of these multiple objects have specific functions or specific dispositions within the system. So functions for the solar system probably not, but for all the other systems I mentioned, we have specific functions. That gives a definition of what a system is. And it doesn't fit into Aristotle's categories. There is nothing here for systems. Systems interconnect with other systems, and so that's something else that we have to add to our ontology of systems. And furthermore, systems very often contain other systems as parts. The separation between these two systems is not a physical separation, it's not a physical discontinuity. And certainly not if you look at the way they're actually intersecting with each other in a single piece. It's a kind of fiat boundary rather than a physical discontinuity. And systems have functions, again leaving aside the solar system, which means they can malfunction, and then sometimes they really do malfunction and then you die. So what we do is we take Aristotle and we add the thing. Well, Aristotle has substances and accidents. He had also universals and particulars. But he didn't have wholes, he didn't have parts, he didn't have fiat and bona fide boundaries, he didn't have systems and networks of systems, he didn't have functions and malfunctions. He probably had some of the function part in his account of final cause. He probably had some of the system part in his account of, for instance, cities, and perhaps even in his account of organisms. But he didn't have the term system, he didn't have an ontology of system. And he certainly didn't have an ontology of fiat boundaries. He would have hated that, because for him everything is natural. So this was put together in 2006. The approach that we're aiming at here, which is basically the DFO ontology, is going to work at every level of generality. So it works for bones and hearts and lungs, but it also, if it's going to be good, is going to work for chemical complexes and chemical reactions. So the same ontology should work at each level of generality. That was our idea. Now, while we were developing all of this, we had in the back of our minds a very common principle which philosophers teach their students when they teach the philosophy of science. And it's a kind of insurance policy. They say, when you do the philosophy of science, you should not interfere with scientists. How could you, a mere philosopher, tell a chemist or a biologist what to do? You want to make it clear from the very start that you're very modest when doing philosophy, and that you're not trying to interfere with science, you're trying to understand science. The problem is that we are living in an age where philosophical nincompoops doing computer science are having a gigantic influence on scientists. So we saw some of that in the HL7 stories. There are clear cases where computer scientists' use of simplified models and a lack of understanding of the goals of science led to scientific problems. And so I see the part of the mission of ontology, which is not part of philosophy, as being a counter to the bad influence of certain kinds of computer scientists. And so ontology is a technology founded by Gruber and his friends in Stanford, has some of these same confusions. So this is the typical HL7 confusion. And the confusion is shown by the fact that he uses exists in sneer quotes. So the use of sneer quotes is very often a mark or of anti-realist philosophy. So you say, exists. Who would ever worry about what exists? What we're interested in is what AI systems can represent. That's the idea. All right, so we've seen some of this. A disease is an act of observation. That's what HL7 says. If we're going to do ontology science properly, then it should not be a part of computer science. It's going to have to work closely with computer scientists, but it shouldn't be just a branch of computer science, just as it shouldn't be a branch of philosophy. But it will certainly play a big interdisciplinary role, and it is playing a big interdisciplinary role. And the better this ontology is as a science, the better it will be able to play this role of fostering interdisciplinary communication and also interdisciplinary integration of the data created by the experiments in different disciplines. All right, so let's go back. What are the typical reasons for founding a new discipline? Triviality and so on inside philosophy. That's even worse today because of all these French people. There are new methods for doing philosophy, namely ontology, for instance, which have empirical results, for instance. And there is an increasing intersection between philosophy and all other disciplines through the channel of ontology, and therefore an increasing need for cross-disciplinary collaboration. And now we have a career path. There are people getting jobs for doing ontology. There are ontology journals, institutes, conferences, societies. There's a subject matter, there are methods, cumulative results, teaching. So here in Buffalo we have the world's first teaching institution devoted to ontology, which is the Division of Biomedical Ontology in the Department of Biomedical Informatics. And there are many industrial applications, and the BBC is one. All right, so this is the international meeting of the BioCurator. Started in 2003, you see, and it's still going strong. BioCurators work with ontologies daily. They are biologists whose job is to use ontologies to annotate data and literature. That's one of the journals. There are other journals. International Journal of Metadata, Semantics and Ontology, for instance. There are conferences. This is just one of several conference series. This is from 2006, but it's still going strong. There is an international conference on biomedical ontology which will be held in Buffalo in the summer next year. And then what are the typical reactions to the founding of a new discipline? So when I gave my talk, Why I Am No Longer a Philosopher, I received, for the only time in my life, hate mail. It was written in red, blood-colored ink.
They're 95.
But basically he didn't think I should have a job in a philosophy department, so I should immediately resign. And he may have a point. It's a struggle for resources. Some people have jobs in philosophy departments. Some people want jobs in philosophy departments. Some people think that philosophy gives rise to new disciplines, and that's going to lead inevitably to periods of time when people who are working in new disciplines will be hired in philosophy departments. In fact, there are some people who think that's the whole purpose of paying philosophers, because that means that you have a fertile soil for the creation of new disciplines or new ideas like artificial intelligence, which was partly an invention of philosophy, or logic or Cartesian coordinates. So this is an old slide of the UB philosophy department, which had this little tiny thing. So they let me put it down here in small type, where we could announce the fact that we had a special track of ontology. So what are the typical results? Well, ontology certainly lacks sophistication, and it's dismissed by established philosophers as trivial, gets and requires much larger resources than philosophy gets. There are several conference series in ontology, more international cooperation, more cooperation with deadlines, so philosophers are slow. Ontology is very often a matter of get this ready within the next 2 days or we'll lose the contract. Publication in ontology journals is much quicker than publication in philosophy journals. Real results. A discipline is shaped by the age when it's started, so we philosophers, of which I'm not one, still model ourselves on the Greeks, the symposium, the idea that you can stand around or sit around doing philosophy. And that's not how ontology was established in a different age. We work primarily through teleconferences. So I attend, on average, 5 teleconferences a week, doing real work with real deadlines. And there's nothing like that in philosophy. There is no branch of philosophy where people are getting results in groups which meet every week or every 2 weeks for an hour or 2 hours to thrash out urgent matters. And we use PowerPoints. All right, so this is the Encyclopedia of Database Systems. And there's an article in this encyclopedia by Tom Gruber and defining ontology. And as I said, Tom Gruber is the father of the Siri app, which is based on ontologies. Aristotle had one database of 158 constitutions, but only one entry survived. This is the Constitution of Athens. He collected 158 constitutions and created an ontology which would look like this. So even Aristotle was already doing ontology.